let me now turn it over to our very distinguished keynote speaker, Vernon Henderson. If you know urban, you know housing, you know international development, you have to know Vernon's work. Renowned for, in particular, his work on urbanization and growth. Again, an economist who publishes in both the leading journals in our field, publishes both theoretical work and empirical work, which is very hard to do, but also gets his fingernails dirty by going to countries that are very poor and trying to figure out how to make them less poor. A lot of work with the World Bank over the years, and I'm sure others. I'm really thrilled that he could take some time and join us here today. Vernon, thanks for being here.
It's a pleasure to be here, and I want to thank the organizers for inviting me. Okay, so this slide here is, I'm going to tell a story about it because it kind of frames the talk. This is a picture of Kibera in the front part of it. This is the largest slum in Nairobi and a very well-known slum in Africa. It's these corrugated iron sheet housing. Kibera is about 3 to 4 kilometers from the city center. It is about 1,000 acres. That 1,000 acres was a land grant by the British to Nubian soldiers who served in the King's Rifle. The grant made about 110 years ago. At that time, this 1,000 acres was outside of Nairobi because Nairobi was a British city that had just founded. So the Nubians came and they lived in part of this 1,000 acres. Then at independence, the new government withdrew the grant and said, no, the land isn't yours, although the Nubians or their descendants continue to live on it, and there are still some there and part of Kibera today. Most of Kibera is a slum where illegal landlords operate. The majority of housing is owned by politicians and by bureaucrats who work for the government, or part of the government. They put up these units, they pay them off, even though the rents are really low, they pay them off in about 2 to 3 years, 2.5 years, and then they make good money on them. The money they make, however, is a fraction, maybe a third of what the value of the land is in the formal sector use that you can see ringing the slum. So, those are formal sector units. They're pretty valuable. The land is pretty valuable. The problem is, the highest and best use of this land is no longer a slum. Slums are generally, as we'll see, on the city outskirts. They're very land intensive, so you build them where land is cheap. The problem here is, how do you overcome what is really this mess where Nubians, their descendants, have some moral claim, at least to part of the land. There are politicians and bureaucrats making money off of this who are opposed to reform because they would lose their profitable businesses and they have no claim to the land. So you're kind of stuck with this slum that's really on prime land. So that's going to be something that we're going to talk about in general. So as Richard said, this is about urbanization. It's about, and what I'm going to talk is, that's the context of moving people from the countryside into cities and establishing these massive capital stocks of housing and then of public capital. On the bottom there is a nicer picture of Nairobi. So where is this relevant today in terms of urbanization? We're thinking of sub-Saharan Africa, and a lot of the examples I'm going to talk about today involve sub-Saharan Africa. South Asia, Southeast Asia, those are the places that are urbanizing. There, about 30 to 50% of the population, depending on the country, is urbanized. That is a massive increase already from maybe 18%, 15%. And that's going to continue up to 70, 80%, depending on the country. And it leads to populations in major cities doubling every 20 years. That's massive growth, far more than anything we see in developed countries. The problem is, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, that this is happening at a time when these countries are still very poor compared to when other countries urbanized historically. And there's a lack of institutions, there's a lack of money to build the infrastructure that one would like to have to go with a very large city. And so we're urbanizing while poor, and how do we deal with that? I'm not going to talk so much about Latin America and East Asia, although I will draw some examples. Those are places that now have been urbanized for some period of time, and the focus is really on not dealing with this massive inflow, but cleaning up problems from the past. So, it's true, as Richard said, if you try to say that urbanization causes growth, you can't show that empirically. They're highly correlated. They go hand in hand. We think a part of being a competitive economy is having well-functioning cities and having competitive cities. That means you need to be able to move goods and people through your cities. You need to invest in public infrastructure. There's this really nice paper on historical London that looks at the impact of building the rail and the underground on the organization of London. So this is starting in the mid-19th century, where people basically lived next to where they worked. They commuted about a kilometer at most, whatever they could walk, to fast forwarding after the construction of the rail system and the underground system to the first part of the 20th century. Then people are commuting 5 or 6 kilometers. You have the separation of workplace and living place. You have exodus of people out of the City of London and the City of Westminster, and inflow of jobs, and this clustering, which is really, we think, is essential to exploiting agglomeration economies. So you need to organize your cities, and as argued, you need decent housing for the folks. A comment here is that when we're thinking about developing countries and housing, we need to think about not building new cities or focusing on edge city developments. We really need to deal with the fact that most of this happens, and most development and redevelopment happens in already existing parts of the city, and we need to deal with how to restructure and rebuild these cities. It's not like you can abandon a city that's a kind of a visibly looks like a disaster. You need to deal with it. What's at risk here? I like to say this, and many of you know it. Housing is the majority of the capital stock of a country. About 2/3 is in buildings, at least. And these buildings are highly durable. People are moving in now to cities. We're investing in this capital stock that's highly durable, that's going to last for decades. And we're making decisions about that now and the shape of these cities. Moreover, we're doing this also for public capital. So if you think about it, up to half of urban land in a city is in public use. It's roads, sidewalks, bridges, public buildings, schools, and so on, sidewalks. Where you put that public capital, the transport infrastructure, determines where you put your housing, because people need access to roads and then to jobs. And it obviously determines how people move through the city and how well they move through the city. So, if you go into Nairobi or Dar es Salaam and you want to cross the city at 11 a.m. in the morning in a car, it takes forever. It's just not happening, right? And that's an issue. So you don't have the clustering that you would like in the city center, at least we think that's the case. The allocation, so this public capital, again, is also the major part of the public capital of a country. So you have these two capital stocks, the public part in cities and the private part, that comprise, in the end, the majority of your nation's capital stock. And you want to worry about how well you're spending that money and investing in that. So for housing markets, I'm going to talk about several things. I'm going to talk about property rights today, because I think that's pretty essential. And maybe it's a drum that's being beaten, but I'm going to beat it again with a bunch of examples. We'll talk about slums and spaces where there are more informal rights and how we want to think about those. I'll talk somewhat about planning and land use regulation. I have a couple of slides on property taxes, but I have a sense I'm not going to get to them. But that's okay. So property rights. In principle, there's a two-tier system. We have in cities formal property rights. These were established in the colonial era in many of these countries, particularly sub-Saharan Africa and parts of Asia. And in the colonial parts of the city, you had these formal property rights, as we think of it, full private property. Those comprise today, obviously, the old colonial section's a small part of the city, but they are an important part, typically the downtown type of areas. And then you have, in the rural sector, you have customary rights. So these are granted by a village head, by a village council. They're strong rights. They typically involve inheritability and rights to use the land. They're enforced by the fact that you know your neighbors, people know you, they know your family, have had this plot of land for generations. And so having title doesn't seem so important. You have these customary rights. They're solid rights. But they don't work well in urban areas because people don't know each other and it's a different world. In principle, you have these cities spreading out, so you should have this conversion right of customary rights into formal rights at the city edge. The problem is that this just doesn't work, right? In most of these countries, you have the land in urban areas held under some form of what I'll call possessory rights. These possessory rights have different strengths depending on the country and depending on what pieces of paper you have and what the history of the piece of land is. But they're, as I said, they're neither customary nor formal. If we look in, this is a sample of owner-occupiers in African cities, maybe about, as I recall, a sample from the DHS of about 10 cities. These are people who are owner-occupiers, anywhere from 10 to 35%, the max being 35%, self-report that they have a title. The rest are untitled, even though they're owner-occupiers, so they have just informal rights. So why do we care? Why do we want to privatize? Why do we want to have full property rights? Well, the usual story is the risk of expropriation, risk of encroachment, issues of inheritability depending on the country, standing in court, again, depending on the country. As you invest more in land, you put more at risk of expropriation. The incentive for someone to try to expropriate that from you rises. This is DeSoto's basic point. So you worry if you're going to do very intensive investment if you don't have title to the land, that you're going to face legal problems. The other is getting loans for construction, loans for purchase, getting insurance. Again, I mean, if you're an insurance company and you're in a bank, you don't make loans to people who can't offer their property as collateral. And they can only offer it as collateral if they have real rights to it. Now, I'm calling it formal rights. There are some countries where some degree of possessory rights is enough to get you a loan, but that's pretty rare. We think that, having private property rights is essential to intensive investment. And there have been studies on titling. These are mostly in slums, and you offer people title, they take up title, they improve their houses, they're happier and stuff like that. This is a kind of at the margin, though. This is looking at slum housing and what happens when you just privatize it. And I'm going to talk thinking about a bigger scale in a few moments. The other is the social benefits. We think of the classic neighborhood externality. What your neighbor does to their house affects you, either the way you look out, where your children play, how you think about your neighborhood. So if you have title you'd like and you want to invest more in your house, you'd like your neighbor to have title and for them to invest more in their house. And then, of course, from the government's point of view, the advantage of having everything titled and formally written down, it makes it easier to tax. Of course, that's a reason not to want to be titled, right? I'll have to start paying taxes. We think of, if we think of China here, land reforms moving out of the Maoist era occurred in the early 1990s. Those reforms were essential to the investment that has taken place. So on the left is a shot of Beijing in 1984, actually a shot I took, and in Mao-style housing, and then here's a shot of modern Beijing. They're not recognizable. And part of making that jump, moving to a new regime and a new world, was in fact having property rights, leasehold rights in this case. So here's two cities. I want to compare them. One is Nairobi, where 90% of the land in principle is formalized and under private ownership. You can debate how well that works, and we're going to talk about that. Versus Dar es Salaam, a similar city in terms of size, slightly poorer country, coastal city versus interior. There are other differences and cultural differences. In Dar es Salaam, maybe 20% of residential housing is on privately titled land. That would be an absolute max. It's probably maybe more like 15%. If we look at the intensity of investment, they're very different. In the graph here, we have the percent of the built area where the buildings are under 4 meters. That is about 90% in Dar es Salaam, and in Nairobi it's under 40%. When you're looking at the percent of the built area, that is then in 4 to 8 meter high buildings or 8 to 16 meter high buildings, say 5 stories, and then much taller buildings or somewhat taller buildings. Nairobi, has much more concentration and higher buildings, more intensive investment than Dar es Salaam. And again, it's private land. So visually it looks like this. This is grid square, average heights of buildings by grid squares. One is a mapping of Dar es Salaam, where you can see either through the color or the visual height in the 3D, the heights of buildings. And Dar es Salaam, there's height near the city center, but the rest is pretty flat. In Nairobi, we have a distinct city center here with tall buildings, and then, but we have height, we have a more typical height gradient starting at the city center and declining as we go out with some spikes on the city edge. So Nairobi is simply built much taller and has much more intensive investment in buildings, cubic meters of building space or heights of building, however you want to measure it. So this is another picture of Nairobi and another rendering of it. And in this, it's obviously a little more detailed. On the left is a land price gradient, just to make the point that land prices vary enormously within cities, declining from the city center, about a 3-fold difference within a matter of about 8 kilometers for the price of vacant land, this is. In the mapping, we have 2 parts. One is the blue or purple, which is the formal sector. The other is slum housing, which covers a certain proportion of the land, and it's in orange. So there are several features to this. First, we have 2 concentric circles, one at 2 kilometers and one at 4 kilometers from the city center. We have, and in those concentric circles, within 2 kilometers today, there is no slum housing left. Within 4, there's not very much left. There were more before. The land is so valuable that the market has found a way to be able to formalize here, even though these are Kibera-like situations typically. Kibera is the slum on the bottom left there that's intersecting with the 4-kilometer ring from the center. That's the 1,000 acres. The slums are built generally very low, land intensive, and that the newer slums tend to be more on the city edge out here on the fringes of the picture. Nairobi is sausage shaped because it's constrained by national forests and parks and military bases to which way it can expand. But one takeaway here is there's this kind of hodgepodge, right, of formal sector interspersed with sort of low intensity in terms of building height housing, really built through just covering the land and having very little green space in slums. Here is another rendering on Nairobi. Sorry to hammer on Nairobi, but it's one of my cities I like to work on. This shows the percentage increase in volume. This is cubic meters of space in a 12-year time period in slums versus the formal sector. So the formal sector is in blue, the slums are in red. The horizontal line here, black line, is at 0, no increase. So right near the city center, there has been very little increase because that was redeveloped a couple of decades ago, and there's really no space left to develop. And then you start moving from about 1 kilometer out. When you get to 3 to 5 kilometers, there is massive redevelopment. In that 12-year time period, about 35% of buildings were torn down. But in a country like the US, it would be 5% maybe of buildings in a 12-year time period would be torn down in a city, something in that order of magnitude. So this is massive tearing down and then reconstruction. When you reconstruct, you're typically tripling the height of the building. And you're typically also assembling a bigger base to build these taller buildings. In the blue, we see that the percentage increase in cubic meters is much more in the formal sector where there are property rights and much less than in the slum sector. This is distance from the city center, so, which I should have said, but it's reading there. That dotted blue circle just highlighting this 3 to 5 kilometers where there's this 50%, 60% even increase in the amount of volume of housing being provided in this city and already essentially developed areas of the city. If you extended the diagram out, you would see more slum growth. I would also note that near the city edge, some of these slums are in private land. At the moment, this is the highest and best use of that land. It won't be for that much longer, but at the moment it is. And so there are private slums here in Nairobi on private land. About 30% of the slums are in privately held land. Those are at the city edge, not the slums inside the city are on this government-owned land like Kibera. So how do we think about slums? And sorry, this is kind of a detailed slide, but I was trying to get it all on one thing and remind myself. So I've done a sort of examples here of different kinds. So we have informal settlements like the kampongs in Jakarta that Macy's worked on, and housing in Tanzania. These are, to some extent, owner-occupied. People have strong possessory rights. In the case of Jakarta and the older kampongs, these families have had those rights for generations. They were not given formal title by the government. And some of these are right near the downtown. In the late 1990s, the government was talking about building out into the harbor, which would have been an environmental disaster, in order to claim space to put up commercial buildings because they couldn't go into the kampongs and repossess them, nor were they willing to give the people in the kampongs property rights so that they, in fact, could have sold their housing and So it was kind of the stalemate. We then had the financial crisis, and these plans went away, perhaps, I guess, probably thankfully. Then we have a land invasion, the classic kind of thing that people studied in the 1980s, thinking of Latin America, or 1970s, 1960s, the favelas in Brazil being the sort of most famous case of squatting, if you like, as it was called at the time, which can be in some sense owner-occupied units, but it's on land that you don't own. It's on public land, it's on land under title dispute, it's on sort of marginal land that has some ownership, but people haven't tried to exercise it, in the sense that the classic stuff from the squatting literature, if people invade your land and squat, if they're not gone within a couple of weeks, your land is gone, basically. You'll never get it back. That's kind of what the literature suggests. And then we have slums where there are what I'm going to call no property rights. The one I gave, the example of Kibera in Nairobi, the Bastis in Kolkata. These are run by, or were traditionally run by, illegal slumlords. They may pay bribes for the right to do that, and they make pretty good money. And in the cases, I gave the example of Kibera to start with, they're owned largely by politicians and government officials. So trying to redevelop these areas, particularly the ones near the city center, where the land and some other use would be really valuable, is really hard. It's hard to overcome the political problems and to resolve the issues. And part of it is just straight politics, your unwillingness to give title to these people in contexts where they have clear possessory rights, and that would be the obvious thing to do. So, if formality, as I'm saying, is so great, why isn't there more of it? Well, you need a registry. You need to survey properties. It's not, I mean, there's this idea you can walk them off and, record it on a GPS system. It's just not very accurate. You end up with boundary disputes. So we still, maybe that'll change, but we still formally survey. And then we need a registry, and we need to record all transactions, including resales. So that's, what formality means, requires the institutional capacity to do that. What are the issues? Well, the first is the cost of the surveying, even mass surveying, and the registry. Work in Tanzania suggests that the cost, just the straight cost, may exceed for many people their willingness to pay for a title. Why is that? They have strong possessory rights. So, why should I spend the money on a title? I can stay in my unit. I can sell it for the same use, maybe at a discount, but I can sell it. Titling really becomes important when you want to change the use, when you want to take it from that single-story building and have much more intensive investment, especially as the city grows, prices rise, and places near the city center become much more valuable. So when you want to convert to commercial use or to intensive apartments, then you really need, then's when titling becomes important. The other is the pricing of titling. So using Tanzania as an example, the Tanzanian government is all about private property rights. We want to have everything titled and fully done as soon as possible. The problem is the pricing. So price of registering your land and getting a title in Dar es Salaam is about 80% of it is just revenue raising. 20% of the price is what the cost is. The other 80% is two sorts of local governments imposing fees to just raise money because they need money. They don't have good taxation. They don't have good property taxation. They want money any way you can get money. So one way is to sell titles at a high profit. That, of course, then inhibits titling. So your experiment of wanting to title everything just doesn't happen because it's too expensive. The third is lack of trust in the registry. So registries are corruptible. You know, stories from Nairobi of, you know, switch titles, fake titles, titles that aren't recorded that are supposed to be recorded, and so on. What does that mean? It means in the housing industry in Nairobi that it's helpful to be a big operator, to be able to employ the accountants, the lawyers, and so on, that will go in and assure and perhaps pay the bribes to assure that you have a proper title, it's formally registered, and so on. There is some movement in Nairobi to having an online transparent system. They've been talking about that now for about 4 or 5 years. Maybe 30% of the properties have been done so far, and it's kind of moving very, very slowly. So it's, if you're operating in that market, you probably want to operate at a scale where you can assure that your title is clear and clean. And if you're a single family owner and you want to, would like to be a single family owner and you're trying to navigate this mess, you know, what's your assurance that you've got a real title and it's not corrupted? Something we'll come back to. And then the politics that I've been talking about. As an aside here, and I don't want to push this too hard, and I'm using Dar es Salaam as an example in Tanzania. I don't like incremental very much. I know it's part of the sustainable development goals, get people pieces of paper, get them informal registration, walk off their properties, that kind of thing. So as an interim step, given the titling is going slowly, in Tanzania, there's something called a residential license. So this is where your property is walked off. It's not surveyed, but it's walked off. You get a piece of paper. It gives you some standing. It's good for 5 years, and it's renewable, and it's really cheap. So the problem is they implemented this program, and then 5 years later, nobody renews it, even for the cheap price, because they don't see the point, right? They're not really used as collateral for loans. In principle, they can be, but that doesn't really happen. And there's no progress towards titling. That was the idea. You get a residential license and you get a title. No one's doing that, so it's not happening. Okay, I want to talk for a minute about equity issues. You know, if you're going to title, you would like those who have possessory rights to get titles. You know, but you've got to price it right. So you have this sort of stalled process in Tanzania. In Nairobi, we have privatization. How did that happen? Well, it happened in the 1990s. It involved a lot of dispossession in a central government decree, presidential decrees, commissioner decrees. It was a very corrupt mess. There were royal commissions on that, or commissions on that, the South Hall report, and so on, detailing all of this. We think, we can't do a forensic audit, but we think that this ended up with a lot of the land in the hands of a few people. And we've already talked about the fact that if you're going to operate in this market, and you're going to do intensive investment, and you want to make sure, and you know the registry is corruptible, then you are trying to operate a business where you can ensure that, and you want to have the scale to be able to do that. So why does it matter, this rental versus owner occupancy? So rental market is important, as Richard pointed out, but I'm talking about really here a different issue. We've already said that the majority of wealth in a country is in the form of buildings. If most people rent, that implies that there's a small group of landowners. People don't typically rent one unit and own another unit that they rent out. So this is OECD data because it exists. In the graph here, on the vertical axis is the share of wealth held by the top 10% of families in the country. On the bottom is the percent of overall owner occupancy in the country. So we start with wealth holdings on the best fit line of about 60% held by the top top 10% of families, going down to about 40%. USA is an outlier in this picture. And we see that there's this relationship. The greater the owner occupancy, the less the concentration of wealth in this top 10%. You can do a Gini or something like that. And the lower the rate of owner occupancy, the higher the wealth inequality. This is sort of what you should expect, and it does happen because, again, you know, your wealth in part is your housing. So if we're looking at wealth inequality, it's going to be affected by the degree of owner occupancy. So in these OECD countries, the lowest rate of owner occupancy is over 40%. In African countries, in 2/3 of these 21 cities that we looked at, primate cities, 2/3 of them, the owner occupancy rate is under 40%, sort of the lowest that you get in the OECD. And we think there's going to be related, again, to wealth inequality here. And it's an issue for the future, right? You have rising housing prices in city, rising property values. Who's going to benefit from that? Is it going to be a handful of people, or is this something that's going to be spread out? So we want to think about that if you're implementing, you know, here I can say Nairobi's built tall isn't that great, but it was done at this cost of, in terms of equity, right? It was done in a corrupt fashion 30 years ago. It's resulted in intensive investment. Tanzania is going more slowly. They don't have the intensive investment, but they haven't dispossessed people either. Do well-planned cities do better? I have no idea. I mean, you know, they ought to do better, right? But we have no data on it. There's no studies that said you grow better if you're better planned. We think it does affect land use and sprawl maybe affects the mode of transportation. You don't really do well with public transport in sprawling cities. Part of planning is regulation. There's good regulation, there's bad regulation, there's ineffective regulation. Economists generally don't like regulation. They typically, in the land market, cherry pick really bad regulations and point out, you know, what the costs of them are, whether it's a minimum height, a floor to area ratio type of thing. And so maybe, you know, from planners' point of view, economists have never seen a regulation they like, and from economists' point of view, planners have never seen a regulation they don't like, right? So we're at odds here. Planners and economists typically don't talk very much. There are some people, planners I do talk to, but in general it doesn't happen. But it's a problem. Housing market's a planned market, right? You know, up to half of the land is in public use in a city. That public use drives the intensity of private investment. And then that private investment is highly regulated. It's regulated for the classic externality reasons. You're trying to separate out obnoxious uses from non-obnoxious uses. You're trying to work with traffic flows. You've got a bunch of things in mind that planners do that economists kind of ignore. So there is a basic issue here. Planning matters, I think, in terms of what happens to cities. I can't say that, again, the growth thing is, I can't argue that. We're going to do this example of Francophone and Anglophone cities in Africa, but it also applies more generally. That Francophone cities, under the colonial era, there was a single authority that came in that wanted to plan the whole market, planning the grid layout of the streets and the neighborhoods, enforcing contiguity. There are planning maps in African cities going back 1910, 1915, or you're laying out the city and deciding how the city is going to be built. Anglophone cities were completely different. There was a dual mandate. The colonial part of the city might be planned. The native parts were just left on their own, native parts as they were called at that time. And there was next to no, or really no overall planning. You started having planning maps maybe in the 1940s and 1950s, recording what had happened, not really as an enforced plan. We think in these areas there's some persistence of the norms from the colonial era. So we have this exercise where we look at 300 cities in sub-Saharan Africa, a third of them Francophone. And we find that the Anglophone cities are more sprawling. They have lower density overall. They have a lack of gridiron structures of roads. And they have a lot of leapfrogging at the external margin. The external margin is important because this is stuff built well beyond the end of the colonial era, but they're still doing this sort of haphazard, hodgepodge type of development. So here are two maps. The darker part of the maps is what was there in the mid-1960s, and the lighter part is OpenStreetMaps, which you really can't see. Accra, British city, and Bamako, Francophone city. And just visually, you can see in the 1960s this gridiron layout in Bamako, this enforced contiguity, this sort of organization of the city that just isn't present there in Accra. The World Bank had a program of sites and services, which I really think of as, in some sense, a planning exercise, right? So this is a program that operated through the 1960s through the 1990s. You took greenfield land, which meant it had to be land at the city edge because you had to accumulate unoccupied land. You planned out the roads, the utilities potentially, and said to people you can self-build. These could be large tracts of cities, and it certainly is in some cities, large tracts. And it may take some years for these areas to develop because they are at the city edge, so there's the transport issue and getting to jobs from these, and we see that in the continuing private initiatives or local national government initiatives, not World Bank, that are going on in certain countries today where you're trying to do the same type of thing that was done under sites and services, but you're locating it far from the city center. This is a form of neighborhood planning. It supplements city planning. In some cases, since city planning is pretty ineffective, it may even replace it. And it lays out the areas for the future. So there's a study on New York looking in the 19th century at the layout of parts of New York where there was a set-aside for roads and other areas where there wasn't a set-aside, and looking today at the difference in land values in the organization and finding that the areas that were laid out simply did a lot better. This is a city in Tanzania, Beya. This is from a paper. It was published in the JPE last year, and it's just a visual, right? You have a treatment group on the left and a control group on the right. The treatment group was one where there was a sites and service program. The area next to it was a greenfield area where there was nothing at the time. That area is now higher density, lower income, more, if you like, disorganized housing. On the left, the sites and services that was planned held as the plan had it, and it's pretty organized. It is not slum housing. It is middle-class housing. There is a demand for this. It is higher priced per square meter than other housing. It's a valuable neighborhood to live in, and it has high-quality stuff. So this isn't about sites and services to do with poverty. This is about sites and services to do with planning and laying out parts of the city for the future when there's going to be a demand to have better quality neighborhoods, more organized neighborhoods. And I mention it because there are a bunch of governments now in different countries undertaking local, national government, not international agency programs to try and to duplicate this. Land use regulation, the last things I'll say here, just as a comment, land use regulation in developing countries is often just really unrealistic. It's based upon, from the colonial era, maybe in Anglophone countries mimicking the English town planning acts. There's a lack of compliance to these regulations because they are just nonsensical, as we'll see in a minute. Does that matter? You can say, well, you pass these regulations and people just ignore them, so what? Well, it means two things. One is you're not planning, if we think that's important. We're not effectively planning. And the other is it creates rent-seeking opportunities because you're in violation of the law. and your property is quasi-legal, you may end up paying bribes or do end up paying bribes to have people overlook that. So 2 examples, my 2 favorite cities today. On the left is Dar es Salaam. Bottom axis is distance from the city center. The vertical axis is the count of buildings that are in or out of compliance with the regulation. What is the regulation? It's a building minimum footprint regulation of 375 square meters as your footprint, which is a very large building. The blue is the count of buildings that are out of regulation, usually massively out of regulation. The orange is the count that are within the regulation or obeying the regulation. It's a tiny fraction. It's minuscule. This is Mark Eliff's graph. On the right is a completely different metric. These are the plot sizes in hectares of lots in Nairobi. And on the left is the distribution, the fraction at each point. The vertical line is at the regulation, a minimum lot size of 500 square meters, which again is bigger than the standard lot in Chicago. And we see that the distribution peaks at about half of that, about 250, and then it comes down and there's a long tail with commercial buildings and industrial buildings and so on. And there's absolutely no massing or anything around the 500.05 hectares that would say people are trying to obey the regulation, they increase their lot size to be in compliance. There's just absolutely no compliance with it. So it makes you think about what regulation is, right? Okay, skipping this. Conclusion, I'm not big on conclusions. So we have this problem of urban institution and governments at low income levels, reform historically slow, looking at Tanzania, versus maybe Nairobi where it was fast but very corrupt. Today, urbanization is rapid. How do we incentivize reforms? Resistance in the public sector, resistance in the private sector. It's a really difficult issue that people are trying to deal with, right? But you think if you can do it, you can have that big push, you get to a completely new regime with a lot more and better guided investment, both public and private. All right, I'm done.
The UN system has adopted the continuum of land rights, which enables you to not get to formal title, but to have a continuum along the way to getting to formal title. So what do you say about that?
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly countries in Africa, I guess Mozambique and so on, where there's been more done with pieces of paper on the way to formal title. And, but I guess I think formal title, if you really want to have intensive investment, you need formal title. You need the land surveyed. And you don't want to end up tied in court disputes with, whose land is whose, and is it really your land? And, it's like Brazil before titling was written down. It's like you could sell the Brooklyn Bridge many times, right? You could sell a piece of property many times, right? And you end up with 2 people holding title, 3 people holding title. You need a registry for formality. So you can have in a village or more informal settlements, you don't need that. Everybody knows it's vested in common knowledge that your families have this piece of land, but you don't have that common knowledge in a city. People don't know each other and they turn over quickly. So maybe I'm just too biased by the experiment in Dar es Salaam, that's just clearly with the government continuing to push this residential license program and clearly it being so absolutely ineffective. But maybe you come up with an example where it's more effective.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thanks.